Hi, my name is Colleen, and I am 57 years old. What I am about to share happened just 6 months ago during what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime with my son Jake. We were on a safari in Kenya, something I had dreamed of for years and saved up for as a surprise gift for his 28th birthday. I thought 2 weeks in the African wilderness would finally bring us closer together after years of growing apart. I never imagined that one scorching afternoon in the Masai Mara, my own son would abandon me in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by lions and elephants with no water and no way home. Before I share what happened out there, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. And please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Trust me, you will want to hear how this safari changed everything between my son and me. To understand how we ended up in that terrifying situation, I need to take you back to the beginning. Jake and I used to be incredibly close. When his father died of a sudden heart attack 12 years ago, Jake was just 16, and it was just the two of us against the world. I worked double shifts at the bank during the day and waited tables at a local diner 3 nights a week just to keep us afloat. Those were tough times, but we had each other. I remember how Jake would wait up for me after my evening shift no matter how late I came home. We would sit at our little kitchen table, and he would tell me about his day at school, while I ate whatever leftovers I had brought home from the restaurant. He was my bright spot, my reason for pushing through the exhaustion and the grief. He was smart, funny, and despite everything we had been through, he seemed to understand that I was doing my best. But something changed when Jake went away to college. At first I thought it was just the natural process of growing up becoming independent. The phone calls became shorter and less frequent. When he came home for holidays, he seemed distant, always eager to get back to his dorm. I told myself it was normal. Kids grow up, they build their own lives. After graduation, Jake landed a job at a prestigious investment firm in Chicago. Within a few years, he was making more money than I had ever dreamed of. He bought a luxury apartment, drove expensive cars, and lived a life that seemed so far removed from our modest little house in Ohio. Our conversations became even more strained. He would call dutifully every few weeks, but our talks felt forced, like he was checking an obligation off his list. The last time we had spent any real time together was 2 years ago at Christmas. Even then, Jake seemed anxious to leave, constantly checking his phone and talking about work projects he needed to get back to. When he left that January morning, something in my heart told me we were drifting further apart than ever before. That is when I decided to plan the Kenya safari. I had read about it in a travel magazine and thought it might be exactly what we needed. Something completely different from our usual awkward dinners and stilted phone conversations. I spent months researching the perfect safari lodge, saving every extra penny I could, and planning what I hoped would be a healing experience for both of us. When I surprised Jake with the trip for his birthday, his reaction was not what I had expected. Instead of excitement, I saw something that looked almost like annoyance flash across his face. He accepted, but I could tell it was more out of guilt than genuine interest. Still, I held on to hope that once we were there, surrounded by the beauty of Africa, we would find our way back to each other. The flight to Nairobi was our first indication that this trip might not go as I had planned. Jake spent most of the 15-hour journey with his laptop open, working on some urgent project that apparently could not wait. When I tried to engage him in conversation about what we might see on our safari, he gave me polite but brief responses before returning to his screen. The heat hit us like a wall when we stepped off the plane in Nairobi. The air was thick and humid, and I could see Jake already looking uncomfortable as sweat began to form on his forehead. As we waited for our connecting flight to the Masai Mara, Jake complained about the airport facilities, the lack of decent Wi-Fi, and the general chaos around us. I tried to stay positive, pointing out the colorful fabrics worn by local women and the excitement of finally being in Africa, but Jake seemed more focused on the inconveniences. Our safari lodge was everything I had hoped it would be. Rustic but comfortable, with a stunning view of the Savannah stretching endlessly in every direction. The staff welcomed us with warm smiles and cold beverages, and I felt my spirits lift for the first time since we had left home. Jake, however, immediately asked about internet connectivity and seemed disappointed when told that the Wi-Fi was limited and unreliable. Our room was spacious with 2 comfortable beds and a private bathroom, but Jake found fault with everything. The air conditioning was not cold enough, the beds were too firm, and the sounds of the African night apparently too loud for his liking. I watched him unpack his multiple electronic devices and set up what looked like a mobile office on the small desk by the window. That first evening we had dinner on the lodge's terrace, overlooking a watering hole where elephants and zebras came to drink as the sun set. It was magical, exactly the kind of moment I had dreamed of sharing with my son. The other guests at neighboring tables were animated, sharing stories of their day's adventures and planning for tomorrow's game drives. Jake ate quickly and quietly, occasionally glancing at his phone despite the poor signal. When dinner was over, Jake excused himself and went back to our room, leaving me sitting alone on the terrace. I stayed there for over an hour, listening to the sounds of the African night and watching the stars appear in the clear sky. For the first time, I began to wonder if this trip had been a mistake. Maybe Jake was too old for mother-son bonding experiences. Maybe I had been foolish to think that a change of scenery could bridge the gap that had grown between us. Our first morning game drive was at sunrise. Samuel, our guide, was a local Kenyan man in his 40s, with an infectious enthusiasm for wildlife and a deep knowledge of the ecosystem. He arrived at our room with a thermos of coffee and a warm smile, ready to show us the wonders of the Masai Mara. The open-air Jeep bounced along dirt roads as Samuel pointed out different animal tracks and explained the behavior patterns of various species. Within the first hour, we encountered a herd of elephants with babies, a tower of giraffes gracefully moving across the horizon, and zebras grazing peacefully in the morning light. Samuel's excitement was genuine and contagious, and I found myself completely absorbed in the experience. Jake, unfortunately, seemed unmoved by it all. He sat in the back seat with his arms crossed, occasionally taking a half-hearted photo with his phone, but showing no real interest in Samuel's detailed explanations. When we stopped to watch a pride of lions resting under an acacia tree, I was mesmerized by their power and beauty. Jake checked his email. By the third day, the tension between Jake and me had become impossible to ignore. I woke up that morning feeling hopeful that maybe Jake was just taking time to adjust to being disconnected from his usual routine. But at breakfast, he announced that he wanted to cut our trip short and fly back to Chicago. I felt like he had punched me in the stomach. "Cut it short?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "But we have been here such a short time. We have not even seen half of what this place has to offer." Jake's response was cold and matter-of-fact. "Mom, this whole thing was a mistake. We are not kids anymore. I have responsibilities back home, deals that need my attention. I cannot just disappear into the wilderness for 2 weeks." I tried to explain how much this trip meant to me, how I had saved for months and researched every detail to make it perfect for us. I reminded him of how close we used to be and how I had hoped this time together might help us reconnect. But Jake was unmoved. "I never asked for this," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You planned this without consulting me, just like you have been doing my whole life. You need to stop trying to control everything, Mom." His words stung because there was truth in them, even if I did not want to admit it. After his father died, I had become protective, maybe overprotective. I had made decisions for both of us always with the best intentions, but perhaps without considering that Jake might want a say in his own life. That evening, Jake refused to join the group for a traditional Maasai cultural presentation. He stayed in our room making phone calls and catching up on work emails. I sat with the other guests watching warriors demonstrate traditional dances and listening to stories about their culture. But my heart was not in it. I kept thinking about Jake alone in our room and wondering how everything had gone so wrong. Samuel noticed my distress and gently asked if everything was okay. Without thinking, I found myself confiding in him about the problems between Jake and me. I told him about how close we used to be, about the distance that had grown between us over the years, and about my hope that this trip might somehow fix things. Samuel listened patiently, and then shared some wisdom that has stayed with me ever since. He told me about the African concept of Ubuntu, which roughly translates to, "I am because we are." He explained that sometimes family members need to separate before they can truly appreciate their connection to each other. Like young lions who leave the pride to find their own territory before returning as adults. Unfortunately, Jake had been standing at the edge of the terrace and overheard part of our conversation. When I returned to our room, he was furious. "Great, Mom. Now you are airing our dirty laundry to strangers. This is exactly what I am talking about. You have been guilt-tripping me my whole life since Dad died, and now you are trying to get sympathy from the safari guide." The argument that followed was brutal. Years of suppressed resentment came pouring out. Jake accused me of using my grief over his father's death to manipulate him emotionally. He said I had made him feel responsible for my happiness, that every decision he made had to be filtered through how it would affect me. "I could not even go to college without feeling guilty about leaving you alone," he said. "I could not take the job in Chicago without you making me feel like I was abandoning you. And now this trip. You spent your savings without asking me if I even wanted to come, and then you act hurt when I'm not grateful enough." I tried to defend myself, to explain that everything I had done was out of love, but Jake was beyond listening. The conversation ended with him storming out of the room, leaving me sitting on my bed in tears, questioning everything I thought I knew about our relationship. The next morning started with an ominous feeling that I could not shake. Jake was already dressed when I woke up, and his bag was packed. He announced that he was driving back to Nairobi that morning and would take the next available flight to Chicago. Panic rose in my chest. "Jake, please do not do this. We can work through whatever is wrong. I know I have made mistakes, but please do not just leave like this." But Jake was resolute. "I am done, Mom. I am done pretending that we can just fix years of problems with a vacation. I am done feeling guilty for living my own life." The lodge was in a remote part of the Masai Mara, more than 3 hours' drive from Nairobi on rough roads. There was no public transportation, no way for me to get back on my own. Jake knew this, but he seemed beyond caring. I begged him not to leave me stranded, but he was already loading his bag into the Jeep that the lodge had provided for our use during the stay. In desperation, I grabbed my small backpack and climbed into the passenger seat. If he was determined to leave, at least I could ride with him back to the city. The drive started in tense silence. I stared out at the vast expanse of Savannah, trying to process what was happening. This was not how I had imagined our trip ending. All my hopes for reconciliation were crumbling, and worse, it seemed like I had pushed my son even further away. We drove for about 30 minutes, seeing nothing but endless grassland dotted with acacia trees. Occasionally we passed groups of wildebeest or zebras, but the beauty of the landscape was lost on me now. I was too consumed with worry about our relationship and fear about what would happen when we got back to the United States. Then, without warning, Jake pulled the Jeep over to the side of the dusty road. We were in the middle of absolutely nowhere. No buildings, no other vehicles, no signs of human civilization as far as the eye could see. "Get out," Jake said quietly, not looking at me. I thought I had misheard him. "What did you say?" I said, "Get out. If you want to stay in Kenya so badly, then stay. Walk back to your precious safari lodge." I stared at my son in disbelief. "Jake, what are you doing?" "There are wild animals out here. I do not have any water or supplies." But Jake's face was stone cold. "You wanted an adventure, Mom. Here it is. Maybe this will teach you that you cannot control everything." I sat frozen for a moment, unable to believe that my own son was about to abandon me in the African wilderness. But when Jake reached across me and opened the passenger door, the reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow. "Jake, please," I whispered, tears starting to stream down my face. "I am your mother." "Then start acting like one instead of trying to be my conscience," he replied without emotion. I climbed out of the Jeep on shaking legs, still hoping that this was some kind of terrible joke, that Jake would come to his senses before actually driving away. But as I stood there in the blazing African sun, watching my son put the vehicle in gear, I realized that he was serious. Jake drove away without looking back, leaving me standing alone on a dusty road in the middle of the Masai Mara, with nothing but my small backpack, no water, no phone signal, and no idea which direction to walk to find safety. The first few minutes after Jake drove away were the most terrifying of my life. The silence was overwhelming. No sounds of civilization, just the distant calls of unknown birds and the rustle of grass in the wind. The sun was directly overhead, and I could already feel the heat beginning to sap my strength. I forced myself to think rationally. Panic would not help me survive. I remembered some of the things Samuel had told us about the African bush during our game drives. Find shade during the hottest part of the day. Conserve energy. If you are lost, stay in one place and wait for help rather than wandering aimlessly. I spotted a large acacia tree about 50 yards from the road and made my way toward it. The shade was a blessed relief from the direct sunlight. I sat down with my back against the trunk and tried to assess my situation. My backpack contained my passport, some cash, a bottle of sunscreen, and a granola bar. No water, no phone with signal, no emergency supplies. As the reality of my situation sank in, so did the emotions. How had my relationship with Jake deteriorated to this point? How had the son who used to wait up for me after my late shifts become someone capable of leaving me to die in the wilderness? I thought back to the years after his father's death. I remembered the nights I would lie awake worrying about how to pay the bills, how to be both mother and father to a grieving teenage boy. I remembered making decisions quickly without consultation, because there was no time for long discussions when you are working 16-hour days just to survive. Maybe Jake was right. Maybe I had been controlling. Maybe in my desperation to keep our little family together, I had held on too tightly. Maybe my son's anger was justified, even if his method of expressing it was cruel beyond imagination. An hour passed, and the heat became almost unbearable. My lips were already starting to crack from dehydration, and I could feel my energy flagging. I tried to stay positive, telling myself that Jake would come to his senses and return for me. But as another hour passed with no sign of the Jeep, I began to accept that I might be on my own. That is when I heard them. Deep rumbling sounds that I recognized from our game drives. Elephants. A whole herd of them moving slowly through the savannah in my direction. My first instinct was terror. These were massive wild animals that could easily trample me without even noticing. But as they came closer, I was struck by their grace and dignity. The matriarch led the group, an enormous female with weathered tusks and wise eyes. Behind her followed several adults and 3 babies who stayed close to their mothers. They moved with purpose but without urgency, browsing on acacia leaves and grass as they went. The matriarch seemed to sense my presence. She turned her massive head in my direction and looked directly at me. For a moment we regarded each other across the expanse of savannah. Then to my amazement, she began walking toward me. I held my breath as this magnificent creature approached. She stopped about 10 feet away and extended her trunk in my direction. Not threatening, but curious. It was as if she was trying to understand what this strange pink creature was doing alone in her domain. We stayed like that for several minutes, woman and elephant looking at each other with mutual respect. Then she turned and rejoined her herd, and they continued on their journey. But something about that encounter filled me with a sense of peace I had not felt in years. Here I was completely vulnerable, and at the mercy of nature, and I had been shown kindness by one of Africa's most powerful creatures. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I knew I had to make a decision. I could stay by the tree and hope for rescue, or I could start walking. I remembered that we had passed a distinctive rock formation about an hour before Jake abandoned me. If I could find that landmark, I might be able to retrace our route back toward the lodge. The temperature began to drop as darkness approached, and I could hear the sounds of the African night beginning. Distant roars that might have been lions, the whooping calls of hyenas, and the rustle of unknown creatures moving through the grass. But instead of terrifying me, these sounds now seemed like part of a vast living symphony. I started walking, guided by the stars that Jake had taught me to identify during camping trips when he was young. Those were happier times when he still thought his mother was the smartest person in the world and hung on every word I said. Now, ironically, the knowledge he had shared with me as a child might be what saved my life as an adult. Each step was difficult in the darkness, but I kept moving forward, driven by a determination I did not know I possessed. I was going to survive this. I was going to prove to myself and to my son that I was stronger than either of us had imagined. Back at the safari lodge, Jake was discovering that abandoning your mother in the wilderness is not as easy to live with as you might think. He had returned to the lodge in a rage, stormed up to our room, and thrown himself into a chair, trying to convince himself that he had done the right thing. Mom needed to learn that she could not manipulate people with guilt trips and emotional blackmail. But as the hours passed, the adrenaline of anger began to fade, and other emotions started to creep in. He found himself standing on the terrace where we had eaten dinner that first night, looking out at the vast expanse of Savannah and realizing just how isolated and dangerous it was out there. When Samuel returned from an afternoon game drive with other guests, he immediately asked about me. "Where is your mother tonight? Will she be joining us for dinner?" Jake had planned to brush off the question with some casual excuse, but something in Samuel's concerned tone made him defensive. "She is fine. She is probably back at the room." But Samuel was too experienced a guide to be fooled so easily. He had seen the tension between Jake and me, and my absence from dinner was concerning. "I have not seen her since this morning. Are you certain she is okay?" "Look, she wanted to stay in Kenya so badly, so I let her stay," Jake snapped. "She can take care of herself." The words sounded hollow even to Jake's own ears. Samuel's expression changed from concern to alarm. "What do you mean you let her stay? Where exactly did you leave her?" And that is when the full reality of what Jake had done began to hit him. As he described the location where he had abandoned me, Samuel's face grew increasingly serious. "You left her alone on the Mara Road with no water and no communication?" Samuel asked, his voice barely controlled. "At this time of day?" Other lodge guests had gathered around, drawn by the urgent tone of the conversation. When they heard what had happened, their shock was evident. An elderly British couple looked at Jake with unconcealed disgust. A family from Germany offered immediately to join any search effort. Samuel began organizing a search party with the efficiency of someone who understood that every minute could be critical. "Lions hunt at night," he explained to Jake, whose face had gone pale. "Hyena packs become active after sunset. If she became disoriented and walked in the wrong direction, she could be miles from any help by now." Jake felt sick to his stomach. What had he done? In his anger and self-righteousness, he had potentially sentenced his own mother to death. All the resentment and justified rage in the world could not change the fact that Colleen was a 57-year-old woman, alone in one of the world's most dangerous wilderness areas. The search party consisted of Samuel and 2 other experienced guides, along with Jake and several volunteer guests. They took 3 vehicles and spread out to cover as much ground as possible. Samuel had equipped everyone with powerful flashlights, radios, and emergency medical supplies. Jake drove frantically along the route he had taken that morning, calling my name into the darkness. "Mom, Mom, can you hear me?" His voice was raw with desperation and guilt. How could he have been so cruel? How could he have let his anger override every instinct of love and protection he had ever felt for me? The hours seemed to crawl by. Every shadow could have been a person or a dangerous animal. Every sound made Jake's heart race with hope and terror. Radio communications crackled between the search vehicles as they systematically covered different areas. Then around 11 o'clock, one of the other guides radioed that he had spotted a figure moving slowly along a ridge about 2 miles from where Jake had abandoned me. "I have visual contact with someone on foot, moving toward the lodge road." Jake's heart nearly exploded with relief and fear. He raced toward the coordinates, his headlights bouncing wildly as the Jeep lurched over the rough terrain. And then there I was, caught in the beam of his headlights, walking steadily along what I hoped was the right path home. Jake leaped from the vehicle before it had completely stopped and ran toward me. "Mom! Oh God! Mom, I am so sorry." I was exhausted, dehydrated, and sunburned, but I was alive and walking under my own power. When Jake reached me, he threw his arms around me and held me tighter than he had since he was a child. "I am so sorry," he kept repeating. "I could have killed you. I almost killed my own mother." I was too tired and emotionally drained to respond with anything but relief. "I survived, Jake. I managed to whisper. "I am tougher than you think." The drive back to the lodge was conducted in emotional silence. Jake's hands were shaking on the steering wheel as the full magnitude of what could have happened washed over him. He had been angry at me for being controlling, but his response had been to take complete control over my safety and well-being in the cruelest way possible. The medical check at the lodge confirmed that I was dehydrated and suffering from minor heat exhaustion, but otherwise unharmed. The nurse gave me fluids and advised rest, but said I had been remarkably fortunate given the circumstances. Jake did not leave my side that night. He sat in the chair next to my bed, bringing me water and checking on me every few minutes. Every time I stirred, he would ask if I needed anything, if I was in pain, if I was angry with him. The truth was, I was not angry. I was hurt, certainly, and shocked by what had happened. But sitting in that darkness for hours, facing the very real possibility that I might die alone in the African bush, had given me clarity about what really mattered. The next morning, we had the most honest conversation we had shared in years. Jake started by apologizing not just for abandoning me, but for the years of resentment and coldness that had led up to that moment. "I have been angry at you for so long," he admitted. "After Dad died, I felt like you needed me to be okay so badly that I was not allowed to grieve properly. Every decision you made for us felt like another way you were trying to control how I processed everything." I listened without interrupting, finally understanding how my well-intentioned protection had felt to a grieving teenager who needed space to figure out his own relationship with loss. "When I went to college," Jake continued, "it was the first time I felt like I could make choices without worrying about how they would affect your emotional state. And I guess I got addicted to that independence. But instead of talking to you about it, I just kept pulling away. I acknowledged my own role in creating the distance between us. After his father died, I had been so focused on keeping our little family intact that I had forgotten to let Jake grow up and make his own mistakes. I had made decisions based on my fears rather than his needs. I was so afraid of losing you too," I told him. "I think I held on so tightly that I pushed you away without even realizing it." We both cried that morning. Real tears, not the angry, frustrated tears of our fight, but the healing tears of two people who had finally found their way back to honesty with each other. The remaining week of our safari was completely different from the first few days. Jake put his phone away and engaged with everything Samuel showed us. We watched elephants playing in a river, witnessed a lion hunt, and sat under the stars, sharing stories about his father and memories from Jake's childhood. Samuel became a friend to both of us, sharing not just his knowledge of wildlife, but his wisdom about family relationships. He told us that in traditional African cultures, conflict between family members is seen as an opportunity for growth, rather than a reason for permanent separation. On our last morning in Kenya, Jake and I sat together watching the sunrise over the Masai Mara. The same landscape that had nearly become my grave was now the backdrop for our reconciliation. "I almost lost you forever," Jake said quietly. "Not just that night, but over all these years. I was so focused on proving my independence that I forgot how much I need you in my life." "Sometimes we have to lose each other to find each other again," I replied. That night in the savannah taught me that I am stronger than I knew, but it also reminded me that strength does not mean you have to face everything alone. The flight home was different too. Jake held my hand during takeoff, something he had not done since he was a little boy afraid of flying. We talked about his work, not as something that separated us, but as something he was proud to share with me. I told him about my life in Ohio, not as a list of sacrifices I had made for him, but as choices I had made because I wanted to build a good life for both of us. 6 months have passed since our Kenya trip, and our relationship is stronger than it has ever been. Jake visits me once a month now, not out of duty, but because he genuinely wants to spend time together. We talk on the phone every week, real conversations about our lives, our hopes, and our challenges. I learned something about myself that night in the savannah. I am more resilient and independent than I had ever imagined. I had spent so many years defining myself as Jake's mother and his father's widow that I had forgotten I was also just Colleen, a woman capable of surviving and thriving on her own. Jake learned something too. He discovered that needing your family does not make you weak or dependent. Independence does not have to mean isolation. You can be your own person while still maintaining deep connections with the people who love you. We still have work to do. Years of misunderstandings do not disappear overnight. But now we are doing that work together with honesty and respect for each other's perspectives. That day in the Savannah did not break us. Instead, it broke down the walls we had built between us. Sometimes love means letting go, and sometimes it means fighting to come back. The wisdom is knowing which situation calls for which response. That night under the African stars, both Jake and I learned that our love for each other was worth fighting for. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a relationship that seemed broken beyond repair, but somehow found its way back to healing? What did it take for you to reconnect with someone you had grown apart from? Share your story in the comments below, because your experience might help someone else who is struggling with family relationships. If this story touched you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about family forgiveness and finding your way back to each other. Share this with someone who might need to hear that even the most damaged relationships can be healed with honesty, patience, and love. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you find the courage to bridge whatever gaps exist in your own family relationship.